the calling of the 12 apostles. Mark chapter 3. And glad to have everybody online. Good to see you, Celine. I hadn't been looking. And Amanda and Hannes, Emrio, Titia, everybody. Glad you're with us in spirit. All right, so Jesus is now preparing to appoint 12 of his disciples as apostles. Up to this point, his followers have been known as disciples. And a disciple simply means a follower, a learner, or a student. That's what a disciple is. If you go to, say, university or whatever, and you really enjoy math, you become a disciple of math. You become a student of math, or you become a student of science, you become a student of whatever. Well, these people were gathered around Jesus every day because they were a student of him. And Jesus is especially going to appoint 12 men and empower them to do what he has been doing, which is really cool. He is our master teacher. He's our example, that he did not just take all this power unto himself and then command the world around him. He actually said, now guys, you do it. And that is a great leadership process here. So let me just say in summary, before we get into the study, every believer needs to be more than just born again. As you're going to see, we all need to be disciples. Well, I know people who claim to be apostles, and they're not. But people kind of want to be all kinds of different ranges on the spectrum of Christianity. Obviously, the most important thing to do is be saved, to be born again. But that's just the beginning. Christ wants you a disciple of him all your life. So, and now, it's not an easy thing being a disciple. You know, it's very easy to get saved, isn't it? It's the easiest thing you could ever do to get saved. But Jesus actually, and Gavin taught there a couple of weeks back, and now he's even further away. Gavin spoke to the men and preached on Luke, where it says that except a man deny himself and his wife and his parents and hate his own mother and father, sister, brother, he cannot be my disciple. Which says, all right, discipleship is a tall order. There's a commitment there. So I want you to understand, Jesus doesn't look just from the saved to use for great purposes. He looks for those who are committed to him. He looks for disciples. That's what I want us to, none of us can be apostles. But every one of us have to become disciples. So let's start there in verse 13. We'll see the calling of these 12. Mark chapter 3 in verse 13 says, and he, Jesus, goeth up into a mountain, and calleth unto him whom he would, and they came unto him. Now this is our introduction to the thought that Jesus called men. And he, basically a calling is a choice by God. It's not my own choice. It's not a vocation that I choose or somebody chooses for me. Jesus chose a select few men from amongst those massive crowds. By the way, no church called these men. And none of them volunteered to be a disciple, an apostle. They were specifically called by name and by Jesus himself. Jesus, in Matthew, it says that he went up onto the mountain before he actually made the choice for who was going to be his apostles. He actually spent all night in prayer, which shows just how far Jesus was going to go as a man to do everything just right. He could have just made the choice, and it would have been right, but he chose to, as a man, pray all night before big decisions like that. Now, has there been other times where God has chosen people by name? And can you give me an example? Who has God chosen for a specific purpose by name? Well, God says to Jeremiah, before you were born, I knew you, yes. But there's a couple of times where God actually speaks the name. From the burning bush, he spoke out to Moses, and he said, Moses, Moses, take your shoes off. You're in holy ground. And he calls him by name. Samuel was the same. Young Samuel, God kept calling and said, Samuel, and Samuel kept thinking that Eli was calling him. And it was God calling Samuel by name. So here are these 12 men. They come out of the crowd. They step forward and they stand alongside Jesus. This is a big deal. There are multitudes of people watching, and he calls out. It's kind of like school, or maybe like the military, where they call out a name, and all of a sudden you're now no longer part of the crowd. You are with Jesus. So they step forward, and I think I asked somebody last week, I might have been talking to Gavin or something, where, or I don't remember who it was, but do you think, I think it was Joseph Manley, do you think that these men had any idea what Jesus was calling them to do when he called them by name? Do you think they had any idea what he was going to do with them? No. And that's a reality of the call of God. When God does call you to do something, you usually have no idea what it's going to be. And if you did, you would definitely run for the opposite direction. So these men are starting where we all start off, which is they're just trusting Jesus. Now look at verse 14 and the ordaining. So verse 13, he calls unto him whom he would, specific people that he wants. In verse 14, he ordained, and there's a key number there, 12. He ordained 12 that they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach. So ordaining is a very Bible word. It simply means he charged them with new responsibility. He gave them a responsibility, okay? Now, we don't ordain babysitters, but they are charged with a responsibility when you leave home and somebody's taking care of your child. All right, so ordaining means Jesus is putting a responsibility on these 12 men. When Garda finish their training, I don't know how many years you have to go to Garda school. Is it 2 years? How long does it have to be to train to be a Garda? 3 years? Oh, how many? 26 weeks. Okay, I was not sure. Okay, but in that 26 weeks, when they graduate, guess what they are? They are charged with new responsibilities and with new authority, aren't they? They are given that charge. And that is what it was like when all of a sudden, here's Peter, James, John, who had no authority, had no power, had nothing, and all of a sudden they were ordained by Jesus Christ. We would say they were appointed to a special task. That's what it means, ordained. Or they're set in a position of authority and power. Now, Jesus ordains them for 3 things, all right? Number 1, to be with him. That's why you find in Acts chapter 6, it says, we will give ourselves continually to what? To prayer. They want to make sure they stay close to Jesus. That was their highest calling. So they were, from that moment on, they're going to be always watching, always learning, and always copying whatever they saw Jesus do and whatever he said. Second thing, he ordained those men to go and to preach wherever he might send them, no matter where. Now, when you were a Jew and you were with Jesus and Jesus preached, do you think anybody thought of the Gentiles? Do you think they ever thought about going and preaching to the Gentiles? No. But the call that Jesus was commissioning them with ends up with go into all the world. How far will Christ send you is based upon how far you're willing to go. And it is great that the disciples did not argue with Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, that they were willing to go. And Fox's Book of Martyrs tells you that Thomas ends up in India, and Peter in Babylon. Peter did not go to Rome. Paul did, so on and so forth. And the third thing is, we're going to see in this next verse, they were ordained to heal all manner of sicknesses. All manner. There was nothing impossible for those apostles to be able to heal. So look at the empowerment in Mark 3 and verse 15. So in verse 14 it says, he ordained those 12 that they should be with him, that he might send them forth to preach, and to have power to heal sicknesses and to cast out devils. These 12 men were going to be able to do more than just preach. There are times when I go into the hospital, I wish I could do more than just preach and pray. You wish that you could just lean over and touch somebody and watch them get up out of bed. But these men had that power given to them. Go to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. In Matthew chapter 10, it wasn't just a few sicknesses. It says this, Matthew chapter 10, this is the same instance just recorded in Matthew. It says, and when he, Matthew 10 verse 1, he called unto him, when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, we'll come back to that in a moment, he gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out, and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. So if you ever do catch yourself watching Benny Hinn, Robert Tilton, the God Channel, I don't even want to remember all the names of these guys that are on the charismatic channels that talk about healing and apostleship and things like this. You'll never see them actually heal anybody. You'll never see them actually deal with somebody who has a verifiable disease. If somebody's got a crippled hand and it is verifiably crippled, you'll never see it stretch out like it did in Jesus' day. And yet these men were given power to heal all manner of sicknesses and all manner of disease and to defeat any demonic bondage. Did the disciples ask for that power? No, not at all. Jesus just gave it to them. And keep going there in verse 2. So in verse 1, it says, when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, verse 2 says, after he's empowered them, he says, now the names of the 12, what? Verse 2, they turn into apostles. So what changed? Their call, their empowerment. These are not just any Joe Soap who just says, oh, I think I'm an apostle. No, no, no. It is a very special calling. That's why we call them the 12. Go back to Mark chapter 3 now in verse 16. Mark 3:16. And so these 12 special men had no ability. But just by virtue of their calling and their empowerment, they become a group of men called the 12. Look at Mark chapter 3, verses 16 to 19. It goes on, and Simon, Jesus surnamed Peter. So what's a surname? The last name, okay. So which is more important, your first name or your second name, Marcus, do you think? Well, yeah, maybe to your wife, it ought to be your first name, okay. But your surname is a little bit more important. Your surname, Jesus says, all right, I know everybody knows you as Simon, but I'm giving you a second name. I'm giving you Peter as a second name. And it turns into a big deal in a little while. He's actually called Simon Bar Jonah. What does that mean? Anybody remember where he got that name? Simon O. Jonah, okay? Or Fitz Jonah, or Mac Jonah, however it would be in Irish. So Simon Bar Jonah. So his father's name was Jonah. I'm not sure I would want to have a dad named Jonah, but that was his father's name. And after him comes the second guy, verse 17, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. I want you to understand, this is two brothers, James and John. Now, I think that's priceless. I'll come back to this in a moment. And he, Jesus, surnamed them Boanerges. I have to say it right. Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. Does anybody see the word energy in there? All right, so these guys were full of temper. These guys are sons of thunder. They could yell. They could get angry. They're kind of explosive in their mannerisms. And there are people like that. It used to be very masculine for a guy to be able to loudly yell and get people's attention. And these are the first of several brothers amongst the apostles. We'll talk about them in just a moment. The next, look at this. It says, verse 18, and Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanite, verse 19, and Judas Iscariot, which also betrayed him, and they went into an house. All right. So the first thing I want you to notice here is that there's a couple of strange names in there. You might see a guy named Bartholomew. He had another name. Does anybody remember his other name? He's the guy that was sitting under a tree. And Jesus saw him. Nathaniel. Bartholomew's other name is Nathaniel. Matthew is also known by what other name? Levi, the tax collector. Thomas had a second name. His name was Didymus, the twin. That's where Didymus comes from. Thaddeus. Anybody see Thaddeus? When was the last time you met somebody named Thaddeus? Now, that was a 1950s name in America. I knew some people named Thaddeus. They changed their name kind of quickly as they got older. But his surname was Lebbeus, and he was also known as Judas, which would be a terrible name to know yourself by. So he was more known by his other names, which was Thaddeus or Lebbeus. But he was also known as Judas, but Judas the less. Look at the last verse in verse 18. It says, and Simon the Canaanite. Who's this guy? So there's two Simons. There's actually two Jameses. There's a couple. It must have been like 1950s Ireland, where everybody was named John if you were a guy, and everybody was named Mary if you were a woman. There were a lot of similar names. Okay, so there were a lot of brothers. Who was Peter's brother? Anybody remember? Who? Who knows? Who was Peter's brother? His brother went and got Peter actually the first day after Andrew. Andrew and Peter are brothers. We know here James and John were the sons of Zebedee. Did you know Philip and Bartholomew were brothers? And watch this. Matthew and James the Less and Judas, not Judas Iscariot, but the other Thaddeus, they are all sons of Alphaeus. So there were 4 sets of brothers. Matthew, James, and Judas, not Thomas. Matthew, Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus. No. This may be this is in the order that Mark records it, but that doesn't mean that they're brothers. I'm actually going through, when you look at all 4. Only James was the son of Alphaeus. Nope. There are actually 2 other brothers, and you find that out by reading Matthew and Luke and John, and you find out all the little interesting things. So it's nice to have all 4 Gospels to tell you bits and pieces about them. But there were 3. I've read the other Gospels, but it's just like I just don't remember when it comes to each. It's just a neat thing when you find out that so and so was also the son of Alphaeus, and then somebody else records, and so is also the son of Alphaeus, which is really cool. But you have 3 loners. You have Thomas, and you have Simon Zelotes. We call him Simon the Canaanite. And we have Judas Iscariot. They're 3 individuals. Now, all of these men, except for one, were from Galilee. Which one will you guess was not from Galilee? Not you. Which one of the 12 was not from Galilee? I know he says Simon the Canaanite, but he actually... which Judas? You're exactly ahead of the game. Iscariot, his surname tells you where he's from. He's from an area outside of Israel, on the other side of the Jordan River, about middle of the way in Kerioth. Judas of Kerioth is what he's called. And now he may have lived up in Galilee, but he was not from Galilee. And so of those 12, 11, remember in Acts it says, are not all these which speak Galileans, speaking on the day of Pentecost? But Judas wasn't there, okay? Judas had a different accent. He was from Kerioth. Now, how many apostles have there been and always will be? Anybody want to take a guess? 12. There are always and only 12. When Judas committed suicide, the Bible prophesied that someone, and only one person, was going to replace him. It's called his office, his bishopric. And that replacement was, at first, who did Peter decide was going to replace Judas? Do you remember his name? Matthias. Is that your middle name? Yeah. Okay. So Matthias. Now, but who was the replacement for Judas? It was Saul. How many times do you find Paul, almost every one of his letters he writes and he says, Paul, a prisoner of Jesus Christ or a servant of Jesus Christ and called to be an apostle. Okay, so he's always having to remind them, I'm an apostle, guys, because as far as everybody was concerned, Matthias was the apostle because Peter chose him. Now, Peter's not the final authority. What made an apostle? An apostle was a special personal calling by Jesus Christ. And Matthias was called by lots, straws. That's how it said. All right, the apostles in the upper room looked around and says, who's been with us since the baptism of John? And so there were only two others who were not apostles. One was Barsabbas or something, I forget, and the other one was Matthias. And so he quickly got two straws, and he said, all right, Lord, you show us which one is to be the replacement for Judas, and one of them was maybe a half length, and he had them pick, and Matthias picked the short straw or whatever, and all of a sudden, Matthias drew the replacement. Is that how you're supposed to choose what only Jesus could choose? Now, the way we know Paul was an apostle was because guess who shows up and speaks directly to him and says, I have called you for this purpose. And he gave him a job, and from that moment, he was an apostle, personally called by Jesus Christ. So during the book of Acts, you'll find some people not accepting Paul. Number one, he's a murderer. He hated Christians for so long. And then for him to claim to be an apostle was pretty hard to accept. So now you know a little bit of the background, how Paul really had to work at getting people to believe that Jesus had called him. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We'll come back to Mark 3 in just a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. In the Corinthian church, there were people who rejected Paul as an apostle and actually said that they should ignore Paul and the church should be following them. And Paul warned and says, be careful because you have a lot of teachers, but you don't have many fathers. You don't have many people who actually would give their life for you. And he says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 11. I am become a fool in glorying. He says, I know I look like a fool and I sound like a fool by boasting. But ye have compelled me. You've pushed me to say these things, he says. For I ought to have been commended of you, for in nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. What's he saying there? I'm up at the top of them. Don't say Peter's superior and I'm a lesser. No. In nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though he admits I am nothing. Truly, verse 12, the signs. What's another word for that? The proofs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience. He said, I patiently just kept proving myself in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. What did Matthias do that was miraculous? Nothing. Paul could prove that he was an apostle. So come, Paul is the 12th, the replacement of Judas. And that's how come it leads us to one more truth, and that is go to Revelation chapter 21. Revelation 21. Revelation 21:14. The Bible limits the apostles to, I'll give you one guess, to 12. Revelation 21 in verse 14. Speaking of the walls of Jerusalem, watch what he says. Now this is already built. It's not being built right now, by the way, but it says, and the wall of the city, the New Jerusalem, had how many foundations? 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now, how do you have somebody up in the 21st century say, I'm an apostle? If God said there's only 12 of them, and their names are in the foundation in the walls of the New Jerusalem, these walls are not expanding to accommodate new names. So there's only 12. By the way, there are meanings to the numbers in the Bible. The number 12, if you just want to take note, the number 12 is the number of government. It is God's government. How many tribes were there to Israel? There were 12. It's on purpose that way. How many months are there in a year, by the way? Did you know that's universal? And it is a Jewish concept that there are 12. Do you know how old Jesus was when he was in the temple? And asking questions of the lawyers? How old was he? He was 12 years old, which is a unique age. Why anybody be listening to a 12-year-old kid talk about the Bible is my... But they make point to say, and Jesus was sitting in the temple at 12 years of age, 12, he had power over those lawyers. And there are 12 apostles, and they form a structure of government for the church, just like Israel, their form was through the 12 tribes. There was a superior tribe, the tribe of Judah, but it is the number of God's government. Now let's look at the purpose of these 12 men. Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Verse 11. Ephesians 4 and 11 says, speaking of Jesus, Ephesians 4:11, and he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers. Notice the apostles in there. And he gave those 5 leadership roles, verse 12, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, not that they do all the work, but that the saints do all the work, so that the body of Christ is what? What's the verb there? Edified. What does edified mean? Encouraged, strengthened, matured. Love it. Excellent. Okay. So the apostles were the foundation of that. Go to Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 19. Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, speaking to the Ephesian Christians, which were a lot of Gentiles. He says, you're no longer strangers and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens with the Jewish saints. That's what he's saying, with all the saints. And you're of the household of God, and you're built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. So these apostles, along with the prophets, would supernaturally establish the New Testament church. They were going to start this thing, and we're following their pattern, world without end. It is the pattern that we follow. Go to Acts chapter 2, and we'll wrap this up. Acts chapter 2 and verse 41. Again, the purpose of the apostles is not apparent during Jesus' life. They're in preparation for something that's going to happen after the resurrection. Acts chapter 2, verse 41. Then they that gladly received Peter's word as Peter preached, when they received that, they were then baptized. In the same day were added unto them about 3,000 souls. 3,000 people joined church. Verse 42, and they continued steadfastly in what? In the apostles' doctrine. Now, why didn't they just keep going by the Old Testament? Did you ever think of that? Why didn't they just keep reading Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Number? No, the apostles are teaching from the Old Testament, but they're teaching from the words of Christ, and they're expanding and they're developing what we call the New Testament. So that's going to be their job. They are writing and laying the foundation of what we believe now. That's the New Testament. All right, so Mark chapter 3. Back here to Mark chapter 3. In verse 19, the end of it says this. And they went into a house. What's the big deal about that? Well, I wrote down in my notes, I said, 13 men as one. They all went into one house. And now, from now on, those 13 men go everywhere together, whether it's into Martha and Lazarus and Mary's home, or whether it's into Peter's house. Remember, Peter's wife's mother was sick, so he healed her, and then she got up and started serving them, fixing them dinner. But now these 13 men are together. They are one. Guess what they are? They're the first church. They are the first church. under the headship of Jesus Christ. And these apostles stay together as long as humanly possible. In Acts chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The apostles, now Paul is not accepted in the 11 yet, in the 12, with Matthias there for a while. So he's off in Antioch, but those 11 guys plus Matthias are really, really glued to one another. You couldn't separate them, even with the persecution by Saul of Tarsus. When he would come and he would persecute, it took death to stop somebody from being a part of that church. Who's the first person that died as a martyr? Stephen. Who's the second one that was grabbed and then was beheaded? James. James in Acts chapter 12. Who's the third one that was nabbed and was almost beheaded? And yet he walks out and he doesn't even know it's real. It's Peter. All right, so these guys, Peter's staying in the most persecuted environment. He's staying in a city where every governing authority was out to kill him. And where does he stay? Right in Jerusalem. That's Christianity. That's the kind of backbone that Christians had and that I want to have and that we need to have as a church, that nobody can divide us, that nobody can scare us. Now, the Christians got scattered, but boy, those apostles were they said, no, we got to stay together, and I like that. So, by way of summary, okay, these 13 men, 12 men plus Jesus, they all go into one home. Every time from now on, they're going to be always together. Wouldn't that be a good testimony from all of us? It all began with Jesus saying, Nita, Dina, Tony, Tom, I want you guys to be one. I want you guys to be with me. I want you to follow me. And now we're not called in the same way to be an apostle, but certainly we're called to be this kind of close and to be disciples who say, I want to be with Jesus. So they were called, they were ordained, they were empowered, and they were limited. There were only 12 of them, but they got the job done, didn't they? Did Jesus need 5,000 men in order to reach the world? Yes or no? No. He needed 12, and one of them was the devil, all right? I mean, you never have a perfect environment, and yet it's okay. It'll be enough. It always will be enough if we were really focused on addicting ourselves to a relationship with Jesus. All right, so that is the calling of the 12. Let's